Oh, we're writing again.
Yeah.
That's all she did the whole time. Oh, we're writing again.
Oh,
like everything was writing.
Oh my God, I
handwriting.
know. I know, and I'm going to get to that because, good Lord, there was some terrible interactions between Ms. Markle and her hapless guests.
You might be looking at Meghan Markle saying, well, she's in Harper's Bazaar, she's in a big magazine. Sweetie, this is a major downgrade from being British royalty.
They kind of f***ed up their whole thing, went way too hard on we're victims, and they assessed the mood of their generation and America correctly in that we are lovers of victimhood.
Yeah.
But America did finally find a way to say, you know what, we love victims, but you two, we've just had a little too much of it.
Why are there so many people in our car?
It's not a car, Harry, it's bus.
And why does it smell?
We're going to work, Harry, because HGTV canceled our show and we need money.
You can't get work acting, so now you're teaching it, which kind of makes sense and kind of doesn't.
Are we gonna see a new Mega? No, because Netflix is done. Netflix is done, happy, they're close. That this is a contract. This, unlike her dog, Meghan Markle is not coming back to life on Netflix because this is it for her, this woman, guys. Unbelievably boring, sorry.
And look, South Park is known for satire and for mocking people. No one is safe. This isn't the first time they've done an episode on the royal family, but this particular episode was quite scathing in the grains of truth that it held. And I'm not sure how the Sussexes are taking it. Obviously, it is a cartoon.
This didn't feel like just another celebrity roast. It didn't arrive loud, chaotic, or desperate for shock value. In fact, that's exactly why it landed so hard. The latest South Park episode didn't try to scream over the noise surrounding Meghan Markle. It didn't pile on scandals headlines or old accusations. Instead, it did something far more precise and far more uncomfortable. It zoomed in, not on success, not on status, not even on controversy. It targeted performance, the carefully managed tone, the polished gestures, the rehearsed warmth, the way every moment feels designed to signal authenticity instead of simply being authentic. And that distinction matters because satire only works when the audience already recognizes what's being exaggerated. This episode didn't invent a narrative. It reflected one that's been quietly forming for a long time. Viewers didn't laugh because the joke was outrageous. They laughed or stopped laughing entirely because it felt familiar, because it mirrored something they'd already sensed but hadn't fully articulated. That's what made this different from a typical roast. Roasts attack power. This questioned believability. And once satire shifts from mocking success to exposing performance, the tone changes completely. It stops being about humiliation and starts becoming about recognition. So, here's the real hook and the question this episode forces into the open. What happens when satire stops exaggerating and simply reflects how people already feel? This episode hit differently because South Park doesn't circle the same target repeatedly unless something in the culture has already shifted. One-off mockery is easy. Anyone can get roasted once. But when satire comes back again, especially with a sharper focus, it's usually responding to a change in how the public feels, not trying to create one. That's the key distinction many people miss. This wasn't random mockery. It wasn't shock for shock's sake. It was a signal. Repeated satire works like a pressure gauge. The first joke tests the room. The second checks whether the discomfort lingered. The third only arrives if the reaction never fully settled. By the time a show like this revisits the same person, it's no longer asking, is this funny? It's asking, why does this still feel true? What made this episode especially sharp is what it didn't attack. It didn't go after wealth titles, fame, or access. Those are easy targets, and frankly, they're boring. Instead, it aimed at authenticity, or more specifically, the performance of it. The carefully controlled tone, the managed sincerity, the sense that every moment is curated to be received a certain way. And that's where satire becomes dangerous, because mocking success invites debate. Mocking authenticity invites recognition. Viewers don't need to be convinced. They either feel it or they don't. This episode trusted that instinct completely. It also quietly set up an escalation most viewers didn't consciously clock. First comes discomfort, then comes doubt. And once doubt settles in, everything that follows gets filtered differently. But this wasn't the first time South Park circled her, and that matters. The first crack didn't arrive with outrage or scandal. It arrived with something far quieter unease. Earlier parody moments weren't explosive, and that's exactly why they mattered. They didn't trigger angry rebuttals or organized defenses. They produced hesitation, awkward laughter, the kind of reaction where people pause and think, why does this feel strange? That distinction is critical. Accusations invite arguments. Discomfort invites reflection. When people feel accused, they push back. When they feel uneasy, they sit with it. And satire thrives in that space. Those early moments didn't tell viewers what to think. They simply highlighted a feeling that had already been forming beneath the surface. Audiences don't start by analyzing details. They don't pull apart logic or timelines right away. They sense first tone, body language, timing, the difference between something lived and something presented. That instinctive reaction happens long before words like credibility or authenticity ever enter the conversation. By the time analysis shows up, the emotional conclusion is often already made. That's why credibility rarely collapses in one dramatic moment. It erodes quietly. A gesture that feels rehearsed, a setting that feels staged, a moment that looks too perfectly framed to be private. None of these things prove anything on their own, but together they create friction. And friction makes people stop trusting the performance, even if they can't yet explain why. What satire did in those early stages was slow the moment down just enough for viewers to notice their own reaction. Not shock, not anger, recognition. And once recognition sets in, credibility doesn't shatter, it thins. And once credibility slips, authority becomes the next thing people test. Once that first layer of credibility thinned, the response wasn't retreat, it was reinforcement. Meghan didn't step back. She stepped forward with seriousness, with intention, with control. The tone shifted from warmth to authority. The messaging became more polished, the settings more deliberate, the language more careful. Everything signaled, take this seriously. But that's where the problem surfaced. Viewers didn't object to the words themselves. In isolation, the statement sounded reasonable, even thoughtful. The issue wasn't what was being said, it was how consistently, precisely, and predictably it was delivered. Familiar phrasing returned, the same emotional beats landed on cue. The same reflective pauses appeared at the same moments. Over time, it stopped feeling like expression and started feeling like execution. Audiences are surprisingly tolerant of flawed language. They forgive awkward wording, imperfect explanations, even contradictions. What they don't forgive easily is delivery that feels engineered. People react very differently to sincerity that stumbles versus sincerity that arrives perfectly packaged. One feels human, the other feels managed. That's why this phase mattered more than any single interview or feature. Authority isn't granted by confidence alone, it's granted when people believe the emotion behind the confidence is real. And once viewers start focusing on cadence instead of content, on tone instead of meaning, authority quietly collapses under its own weight. Nothing here caused outrage. There was no dramatic backlash. Instead, something subtler happened. The audience stopped leaning in. They listened, but they didn't absorb. They watched, but they didn't connect. Most public figures would have stepped back at that point. She didn't. Satire doesn't grow weaker when it's ignored. It grows stronger when it's answered with more exposure. That's the trap most public figures fall into, and it's exactly what happened here. Instead of letting the moment pass, the response was visibility. More appearances, more carefully framed conversations, more opportunities to clarify, explain, and reassert seriousness. But repetition changes how intention is received. What begins as an effort to be understood slowly turns into predictability. The audience starts to anticipate the tone before the sentence finishes. They recognize the rhythm. They sense the emotional beat before it lands. And once that happens, even well-meaning messages start to feel less like communication and more like choreography. That's when parody truly locks in. Because once a certain image sticks, every future appearance gets filtered through it. The audience doesn't meet the moment on its own terms anymore. They watch for the pattern. They wait for the familiar pause, the familiar phrasing, the familiar gesture. And when it arrives, the joke no longer needs exaggeration. Recognition does the work. This is where seriousness can quietly backfire. The harder someone insists on meaning, the more viewers feel managed. Instead of being invited into a moment, they feel guided toward a conclusion. And audiences resist guidance when they sense control behind it. Not with outrage, but with detachment. The danger of overexposure isn't backlash, it's compression. The range of how someone is perceived narrows until every appearance feels like a variation of the same note. At that point, satire doesn't even need to be cruel. It just needs to hold up a mirror. And then she stepped into the one space satire almost never touches. The Netflix holiday special was a high-risk move, whether it was meant to be or not. Holidays are not neutral territory. They're emotional pressure points. Christmas in particular strips away performance faster than any interview ever could. You can sound wise in a magazine, you can appear composed on a stage, but the holidays demand something else entirely: ease. That's why this moment mattered. Viewers don't approach Christmas content looking for messaging or meaning. They look for warmth, for mess, for the small imperfections that signal real life. Lopsided decorations, awkward moments, family chaos. The things no one bothers to polish because they don't need to be explained. Instead, what arrived felt controlled, carefully arranged. The tone was gentle but deliberate. The gestures were warm but measured. Every moment felt framed to communicate togetherness rather than simply exist within it. And that distinction is fatal during the holidays. Christmas doesn't reward instruction. It rewards participation. Audiences instinctively felt the gap. Where they expected spontaneity, they saw structure. Where they expected familiarity, they saw presentation. Where they expected shared intimacy, they sensed distance. Nothing was overtly wrong. There was no scandal to point to. And yet the absence of disorder became impossible to ignore. That's what made this such a miscalculation. The holiday space doesn't invite explanation. It exposes whatever is already there. You can't lecture your way into warmth. You can't curate your way into joy. And when viewers sense that they're being shown how to feel instead of being allowed to feel it naturally, the reaction shifts. The reaction wasn't anger, it was something worse. The response that followed wasn't explosive. There were no mass defenses, no loud counterarguments, no drawn-out debates about fairness. Instead, the same words started appearing again and again in comment sections almost casually. Staged, forced, boring, fake. Not shouted, not weaponized, just stated as if they no longer needed justification. That's the moment most creators fear, whether they realize it or not. Backlash can be managed. Criticism can be reframed. Even controversy keeps people engaged. But disengagement does something far more dangerous. It removes urgency. Viewers stop arguing because they stop caring enough to argue. They don't write long posts explaining what feels wrong. They simply move on. What stood out here is that people weren't debating whether the content was unfairly judged. They weren't comparing it to past work or defending intentions. They were describing how it made them feel briefly and decisively before clicking away. That shift matters because it signals fatigue. And fatigue doesn't soften with time. It hardens. Once fatigue sets in, every new appearance is met with a sigh instead of curiosity. Viewers approach it already braced for repetition. Even neutral moments get interpreted through exhaustion. Not because they're offensive, but because they're familiar. And familiarity without emotional reward quickly turns into avoidance. This is the phase where narratives don't collapse publicly. They thin out. Engagement drops quietly. Attention moves elsewhere. And no amount of explanation can reverse it because the audience isn't listening closely anymore. They've already decided how it feels. That's why this moment was more telling than any headline or critique. The noise didn't grow. It faded. And when it fades like that, the signal has already been received, and the industry noticed quietly. What made this moment unmistakable wasn't a statement, a press push, or a defensive interview. It was the absence of all three. Netflix's non-reaction wasn't an oversight, it was a signal. Platforms of that size don't miss opportunities by accident. When something lands well, they amplify it. When it needs protection, they contextualize it. And when they do, neither, it usually means the internal verdict has already been reached. Streaming platforms are deeply aware of perception. They don't just release content, they guide how it's received. Trailers, placement, interviews, follow-up features, all of it exists to shape interpretation. So when that machinery stays quiet, it's not neutrality. It's distance, a decision not to intervene. That silence matters because it tells you the debate has moved past defense. There's no attempt to reframe, no urgency to correct misunderstandings, no effort to steer the narrative back toward intention. Inside the industry, that kind of quiet typically means one thing. The reaction aligns closely enough with internal expectations that pushing back would be pointless. This wasn't a PR stumble or a mismanaged rollout. It was an industry shift. The platform didn't rush in to protect the moment because protection requires belief that the audience can still be guided. And once that belief is gone, the smartest move is to let the content stand exactly as it is and observe what happens next. That's the context most viewers never see, but they feel it instinctively. When the machine doesn't hum, something has changed. The energy around the release wasn't charged. It was resigned. That's why the latest South Park episode didn't feel explosive. By the time the third mockery landed, it was no longer fair to call it coincidence. One parody can be brushed off as noise. Two can be dismissed as bad timing, but three forms a pattern. And in cultural terms, patterns don't entertain, they label. What South Park returned to wasn't outrage or scandal. It was consistency. The same tone, the same presentation, the same friction between intention and reception. That's where predictability becomes lethal. In entertainment, unpredictability creates opportunity. It keeps audiences curious and platforms hopeful. But once a public figure becomes predictable, every new project arrives with a preloaded expectation. Viewers don't ask, "What is this?" They think, "I already know how this will feel." And when that happens, interest collapses before the content even has a chance to speak for itself. That's why the joke now arrives before the material does. People recognize the rhythm before the moment unfolds. They anticipate the cadence. They brace for the tone. Satire no longer needs to exaggerate because recognition has done the work in advance. The laugh isn't triggered by surprise, it's triggered by confirmation. Reframed this way, South Park isn't acting as an attacker, it's acting as a record keeper. It returns only when the same signals keep repeating in the culture. Each revisit documents another stage of audience response, not escalation for shock, but confirmation through repetition. By the third pass, the show isn't asking whether the material is mockable anymore. It's quietly noting that the reaction has stabilized, that the pattern has settled, and once a pattern settles, it becomes the default lens through which everything else is viewed. And that leads to the uncomfortable ending no one wants to say out loud. This moment didn't feel like a scandal, and it didn't look like a collapse. It felt colder than that. It felt like a cooling. The kind that happens when attention doesn't explode, it fades. When the volume doesn't spike, it drops. And when the story doesn't end in outrage, but in quiet disengagement. That's the part people often misunderstand. Satire didn't destroy anything here. It didn't take something vibrant and tear it down. It documented exhaustion. It showed in stages how an audience slowly stops leaning forward, how curiosity turns into familiarity, how familiarity turns into fatigue, and how fatigue turns into indifference. Once authenticity is questioned, everything changes, not dramatically subtly. Words don't land the same way. Gestures feel heavier. Intentions get filtered before they're even heard. Every new appearance arrives carrying the weight of what came before it. And that weight doesn't lift just because the message changes. The audience has already adjusted how it listens. That's why this moment matters beyond any single episode or special. It marks the point where the audience feels ahead of the story, where recognition replaces surprise, where satire no longer needs to exaggerate because the outline is already clear. And that leaves one final question hanging not as an accusation, but as a reality check. If satire no longer needs to exaggerate, what happens when the audience is already ahead of the story?